De retour sur le plateau.
Back on the TV set of Vape Expo in the presence of Tim Phillips, the director of Ecig Intelligence. We're going to talk in a very broad way about a subject that is general with details that seems to be determining factors for professionals. So to understand the evolution of the market, to have investment strategies, the market of vaping is quite evolutive. It's still looking for itself. It's innovating into new products. And with Tim Phillips from Ecig Intelligence, we're going to speak about the global vaping market in 2015 and also study together the possible evolutions in the years to come. So before, Tim, you make your presentation, could you introduce yourself, or could you introduce Ecig Intelligence, in fact?
Rémi, thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me here. Ecig Intelligence is an online platform it's a publication which provides market and regulatory information for the e-cigarette sector. We're aiming the product at professionals in the sector, but we are entirely independent of the e-cigarette sector or of tobacco. We're entirely independent. And as a result, we have an objective view of how the e-cigarette market is developing. And we have regulatory bodies who are subscribers to our services as well as e-cig companies. So the British government subscribes, for example.
How did you feel about the presentation of Jacques Lewezek regarding the misinformation about the report of Public Health England? What's your opinion regarding the fact that many people, public authorities, seem to not really understand the vaping revolution?
I think this sector is very new still, and it is going to take a long time for regulation to catch up with the developments that you can see going on in this room around us. The reality is that new technology in whatever sector often has a difficult time being accepted by the general public. And I think it's of no surprise that despite the British government really making a big change in supporting the e-cigarette sector as a way for people who are currently smoking to stop, I think that's going to take a while to filter through. So I'm not surprised that we had the outcome, and we had the French health minister really not backing that report.
Okay, we're going to have a look at your presentation. So you have your slides on the screen.
Yeah, of course. So I've got some slides here. We can go through them really quite quickly. I'm very happy to answer questions if you have any.
Sure.
Really what I wanted to do in this presentation was talk a little bit about our view of the market in general. So a global view of the e-cigarette market. How is it developing? How are the regulations going to affect the market going forward? And some thoughts that I have about particularly regulation and how that will impact growth and the future of the sector. So look, I'm going to talk about a number of things. I have about 10 slides, and I'm going to start talking about some of the themes around the e-cigarette sector. What have we seen happening over the last year or two? What are the main elements of change going on? We'll talk a little bit about market size, what's going on with the market and the growth of that market. And then, of course, a very important topic for this sector is regulation. What's going to happen, particularly in Europe, under the Tobacco Products Directive. And then we'll have a chat about some future thoughts. So, thematically, what's been happening in the market? Well, in France, it's probably hard for you guys to believe, but actually what's been happening elsewhere in the world is that everyone's been joining you in having a product set which is predominantly now based around the open system, around refillable tank devices, That was not the case in the UK and the US. The market started with the cigalikes, but it's very clearly moving very quickly towards open systems.
Have you seen a shift on cigalikes in the US? Can you tell us about maybe a moment where you saw that cigalikes were not that used anymore in the US and in the UK?
Well, I think that they're not ever going to disappear. I think cigalikes will always have a place in the market, particularly in the convenience store sector. There will always be a need for the cigalikes. The problem with the cigalikes, as we all know, is that they're not very good. They don't work very well. But I think that that's something that will change over time. We're starting to see some much better cigalike style products. We're seeing particularly the Pax Dual starting to be rolled out. It works very well, and it's a cigalike style of device. So I think we'll see more of that.
But at least there is a way for open systems.
Correct. Yeah, correct. And I think that the open systems are now predominant in most markets around the world. We track quite a number of markets, predominantly Europe and the US, but we're seeing in all of those markets a predominance now of cigalikes. Let me keep going on this. So we've seen, actually, really to back a lot of that change up, we've seen big growth in vape stores, often independent vape stores that are selling open systems. We've seen a decline and a fall in traditional retail in terms of sales of cigalikes through convenience stores, and that's continuing through to the end of this year and into next. And of course, over the longer term, we've seen tobacco clearly moving into the sector either by acquisition or by development of products themselves. So in terms of market dynamics, those are a couple of major themes. On the regulatory side, of course, we all know about the Tobacco Products Directive. It's May 2016. It's going to have a big impact on every single person in this room, and I'm not sure that everyone has fully understood that yet. The US is still a little bit unknown. The FDA is about to release its deeming regulations. We expect that at some point this year, although who knows? Many people think it may extend into next year now. At the same time, we've had a lot of state legislation around public place usage of e-cigarettes, age verifications, and a number of other areas. And then over and above all of that, we've had some other bodies like the WHO pronouncing on e-cigarettes. So we've had a lot of regulatory pressure on the e-cig industry over the last couple of years. And then I just thought I'd mention a couple of things about product. There's not a lot about product that I can tell anyone in this room. But I mean, I think some of the key themes that we've seen coming through, temperature control is now becoming a sort of minimum requirement in a lot of the open systems that we're seeing. We've started to see box mods being sold, and that's more a marketing thing. It's very clear to us that, particularly in the US, consumers are coming in and buying a box mod starter kit. And that's a new phenomenon, I think. We've started to see particularly big tobacco coming in with some closed system but tank devices. So closed system kind of clearomizer tanks. And those, I think, will continue to grow in popularity, particularly in the convenience store sector. And then we've got alternative nicotine products, and that's for sure one of my themes of what's happening in the future is going to be new types of nicotine products. We're definitely going to see heat not burn taking a hold, but we're also going to see some other products as well. All right, size of the vape market. Well, I won't go into huge amounts of detail here, but what you can see from this chart is just how important the European and US markets are compared with the rest of the world. We've got very little take-up in many of the other regions. You can see a small bar there for Asia. We certainly see huge growth potential in Asia, but the reality on the ground in 2015 is that there's not much penetration yet. So Europe and the US are the two big markets that are happening at the moment. As I've said there, would China open up? And if it did, well, all bets are off. So we'll see. Okay, here's some interesting thoughts on pricing, which impacts markets. one of the big things that we've been tracking is pricing in the US market over time. And we've seen a huge drop in prices across the board. This chart, if you may not be able to see all of the details, but hopefully these charts can be made available. What we're seeing is a big drop, 10 to 20% drop in prices for across the board in terms of product ranges. So we're seeing both in cigalikes and cartomizers and liquids. We're now starting to see, interestingly, in the US market, that the sort of second generation Ego style products are actually now generally level pegging with cigalike starter kits. That's a good sign of the evolution of the product ranges, but it also suggests that these products are under a lot of pricing pressure.
Okay, do you think that this is a sustainable trend, that the prices stay like this, or that open system are close to cigalikes? And regarding the regulation, do you have the feeling that it will increase the final prices for the consumers?
Well, I was talking about this very recently in terms of pricing. I think some of the major pressures on pricing will be around the retail and what percentage of the total price will end up in the retailer's hands. Another major factor that's going to affect price going forward is tax. We're already seeing tax applied in Italy and Portugal. We're going to see it in other countries relatively soon. It's going to have an impact on price for sure. Leaving aside, of course, the impact of regulation and how that will affect players in the market. But I think this slide was mainly designed just to show that there is a lot of pricing pressure on the market. The margins are going down. It's a sign of the market growing up, frankly, and it's going to continue to happen. Having said that, we did quite a lot of analysis very recently on the very high-end products, particularly in the hardware. And this, again, is going to be difficult for you all to see, but the top half of this slide is looking at some of the high-end mods that are now in the market. We've actually compared various different products, but we've looked at a number of online sites where those products are sold, and you can see massive price differential. So exactly the same product being sold for very different prices. For us, that really suggests that at the high-end hardware market, it's still not very consolidated, and there's still a lot of flexibility in pricing, which, again, you know, the prices that are shown on the screen here are likely to come under pressure over the next 6 months to a year, I would say. Again, the bottom half of the product of the slide here just is showing products that are high-end mods, and really what we're showing is, despite the fact that there's huge flexibility in pricing in the US market, it's very clear that the prices are increasing dramatically based on the power output. So I think at the end there, we can the last one is 150 watts. You know, huge devices, huge prices, still fair amount of margin in that business, I would say. Okay, vape stores. I mentioned about vape stores and the impact that vape stores are having on the market in general in terms of growth, particularly in the open system sector. I thought I would just compare this, since we're in France, rather interesting to look at vape store distribution compared with the US. And one of the main things to take away from this is that there is there's a huge difference in the population per vape store in the US compared to France. France actually, as a vape market, is much more mature than the US, which explains why perhaps we've seen a drop in the number of vape stores. We've seen quite a lot of vape stores close over the last 6 months. We're still seeing a lot open in the US, and you can see why. That there are some states in the US where the population per vape store is extremely low. So I think we're going to continue to see the vape store distribution channel expand in the US. I think, as you can see in France, it's probably reached a much more stable base in France going forward.
So where is the nicest states to get Ecigs in the US?
Well, look, population per vape store in Nevada looks like it's extremely low, so everyone should be running to Nevada. You can gamble as well. let me move on. Right, growth. We talked about growth. There is still huge growth in this market, but I think the growth is fragmented. We've seen very little growth in the cigarette segment. We've seen a lot of growth in vape stores, in open systems, and so on. I just, with this slide, wanted to talk about the factors that really have a big impact, in our view, on growth. One, the top one, I guess, is regulation. We know that if you apply regulatory pressure, you restrict what competitors can do in the market, that does have an impact on growth. Not necessarily, by the way, and I'll come on to this, not necessarily a negative impact on
What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that there is...
can consolidate the market in a way that it will provide better products for the consumers, for example?
Yeah, actually my third point down, one of the most important drivers of uptake for new users in this segment is consumer confidence. And we're seeing across the world, actually, very low consumer confidence in the category right now. Mm-hmm. And it's our view that good regulation, which brings in sensible restrictions on players, will actually have a very beneficial effect on growth, because it will give consumers the confidence in the product set.
Yesterday we had a panel team about the US and the European regulations. Do you think it's easier to operate when you're in the US or in Europe? Is it easier to be a European Ecig independent company or an American one? Because we heard that the FDA might be really strict.
Look, the FDA might be really strict, and it might be really strict really soon. But the situation at the moment is that if you're a US company, you need to deal with 50 different states that are having different rules in place all the time. So it's very complicated. That's the same in Europe, though. We're seeing 28 member states of the European Union about to implement a piece of legislation, and they will all do it differently. And we'll come onto that. But anyway, we've talked about regulation, clearly pricing, which I've mentioned. There's pricing pressure on the market, but that will have an impact on how many people start to use the devices and how often. And of course, the big impact on price is the price compared to tobacco. So if you look at the Russian market, a packet of 20 cigarettes in Russia costs less than €1. It's very difficult to apply a pricing pressure towards the e-cigarette sector compared to the United Kingdom that Jack just talked about, where a packet of 20 cigarettes is now something like €14. There's huge pricing pressure on people moving to the e-cigarettes. We talked about consumer confidence. That's very important. It's extremely low at the moment. Jack talked about some small glimmers of light coming from the UK government, but there's still a lot of negative press out there about the sector, and that has a big impact on uptake. Innovation and product efficacy. What I mean by that is the cigarettes, which we talked about, don't work very well. The problem with that is you had a lot of smokers trying cigarettes, deciding that the cigarette sector was not for them, and going back to smoking. So the way that products work is hugely important. It's clear from a market like France that the more sophisticated tank systems are working and are having a positive impact. But I hope that process continues, and it needs to, in order to really move this sector on. And then distribution is my last point. Distribution is still extremely important. The people in this room have probably focused a lot on online distribution, vape store distribution. The vast majority of consumers go to their local store and buy in a convenience store, and that's where the battle needs to be fought. Okay, I've got a few slides on regulation now. One of the things that I mentioned is the Tobacco Products Directive. It's coming down the track very fast. It's going to be implemented by the 28 member state countries of the European Union in very different ways. I wanted to give you some of our analysis of the impact of regulation on a market. So what we've done here, and it's really for illustrative purposes only, but we have looked at a number of markets that are similar to each other, or you could argue are similar, and we've looked at one that has very strict regulation versus one that doesn't. So the obvious one, since we're in France, is to compare ourselves here with Belgium. And you can see that the percentage on the x-axis is the percentage usage rate amongst the 18-plus population. So Belgium, we know, has very strict regimes in place. It's extremely difficult to operate. It's extremely difficult to sell e-cigarette products in Belgium. You can see the impact of that straight away. There's a huge difference in uptake rate compared to France. Again, Australia and UK, we looked at that. Australia has effectively a nicotine ban, which means it's extremely hard to get product into Australia. That has a huge impact on uptake of e-cigarettes compared to the UK, which is a much more lenient market, which allows people to operate in. And then the same, you know, Canada and US less so, and Canada we're seeing a big growth, but Canada is still quite tricky to operate in. And arguably the US has become harder to operate in over the last year, down to, you know, state controls on the sector. So I thought that was good, just illustrative. And regulators need to understand this. They have a lot of levers to be able to pull to change the way the regulatory environment develops. The important thing is to understand that if you pull one lever, you can have an impact on the market. It makes a big difference to the number of people who take up the product.
That will be, for example, the case for Belgium, that will, this country will implement the TPD, probably. So, for example, the ban on nicotine will be pulled out of the, I mean, it's going to be possible to sell products with nicotine.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point, Rémi, because one of the impacts, the positive impacts of the TPD is that for countries like Belgium, it will be a net positive for the sector because suddenly the market will open up. So the TPD will have some very positive impacts on countries that up until now have basically banned the product. And that's really worth bearing in mind.
Thank you very much, Tim, for this presentation. Do you have questions for the Director of Ecig Intelligence?
Do you, Rémi? I've got a couple of other
Sorry.
slides. I can leave
I thought that was the last
actually.
one.
But I was going to quickly talk. I'll just go back to this one. Okay, so there's a patchwork of regulation. That's going to be very difficult for companies to operate in. You know, and you can see our maps here taken from our website, but you know, the different states have completely different policies in terms of the way they treat. This is just taxation, so you know it's going to make it very complicated for companies to operate in.
No, let's go through. We have 5 minutes.
We have 5 minutes. Fine. What I thought. So this anyone can read. This is the TPD and the impact on the EU market. We think it's net positive, but there are obviously positives and negatives about the way that this is going to work, and I'll leave you to read that in your own time. What I thought might be interesting is just to talk about the future.
Sure.
And to talk a little bit more about where we think the market is going to develop. Looking around the room today, it's very clear that this is a market here to stay. But I think that there's a lot of companies here that don't quite, don't quite worry enough about the way that the TPD is going to affect their business. It's going to have a huge impact, and I'm not sure that that's been taken into account by the industry. We've got a lot of competitors to e-cigarettes coming up. We've got heat not burn. We've got a lot of investment going into heat not burn. That's going to change the market dramatically.
What's your opinion on the IQOS, for example?
The what, sorry?
The IQOS. What's your opinion on
the IQOS, PMI's IQOS is going to be successful. I have no doubt about that. They put a lot of money into it. It's a nice-looking device. It's not going to be for everyone. It's certainly not going to be for vapers, but it will be a product that will be attractive to current smokers. So that's for sure going to change the nature of the market. We've got tax coming in. Tax is probably going to be inevitable, however much you disagree with the idea of applying a tax to e-cigarettes. We've got vape shops, particularly in France, I think are likely to consolidate. And in more consolidated markets, they will also professionalize. And we've got new markets that really haven't opened at all yet. We've got places like Germany, Russia, and so on. We think are going to be really very big markets going forward, let alone what happens if China opens up. So those are some ideas about some future thoughts on the industry. Thanks very much for having me, Rémi.
Thank you very much, Tim, and I strongly recommend everyone at the Vape Expo and all over the world to read Ecig Intelligence every morning. It's a really nice job that you're doing and really meaningful for the whole industry, but also other players like the French Ministry of Health that could read you on a more regular basis. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks.